On the Norwegian coast, where the sea meets the land in a constant negotiation of boundary and belonging, there are phenomena that defy all explanation. Fog banks that arrive without warning, mists that move against the wind, clouds that seem to think, to choose, to hunt. This is a story about a village consumed by such a fog, about a god who lost himself inside his own nature, and about the price of freeing a shapeshifter who has forgotten which shape is real. This is Loki's Mist. The coastal village of Havneby had weathered 1,000 storms. Its people were hardened, their resilience forged over generations of survival against the North Atlantic's fury. They knew how to read the sky, how to prepare for the worst, how to endure. But no one was prepared for the fog that came on the first day of October. It rolled in at dawn. Not gradually, the way fog usually arrives, but all at once. A solid gray wall that swept across the water like a living thing and swallowed the village whole. Within minutes, visibility dropped to arm's length. The air grew thick and cold, pressing against the skin like a damp, clinging cloth. It felt invasive wrong. The villagers assumed it would burn off by noon. Coastal fog always did. But noon came and went. The fog remained. By evening, a real worry began to set in. Boats couldn't leave the harbor. The only road out of the village was invisible. Even walking between houses became a treacherous journey. They decided to wait. Surely, by morning, it would clear. It did not. On the second day, the strangeness began. Anna, the village schoolteacher, was walking to the market when she ran into her neighbor, Bjorn. They spoke briefly about the unusual weather. Then Anna continued on her way. 10 minutes later, she encountered Bjorn again, in the very same spot, having the exact same conversation. He said the same words in the same tone. His movements, even his facial expressions, were identical. A chill ran down Anna's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She asked him if he was joking, playing some kind of prank. Bjorn just looked confused. He said he hadn't seen her yet that day. This was their first conversation. But Anna remembered. Every detail, every word. She hurried home and locked her door. Soon, others reported similar experiences. Meeting the same person multiple times in impossible locations. Having the same conversations over and over. Encountering neighbors who claimed not to remember interactions that had just occurred. The fog was doing something to them. Changing them. Copying them. Or worse, by the third day, no one could agree on how many people were even in the village. The census said 342. But when the mayor tried to organize a count, the numbers never matched. Some counts came to over 400. Others barely reached 200. The population seemed to fluctuate hour by hour. People began reporting seeing themselves, their own faces emerging from the fog, their own voices calling from empty houses, copies, duplicates, reflections that moved independently. The villagers tried to leave. They attempted to walk the coast road out of Havneby. But no matter how far they walked, they always found themselves right back at the village center. The fog had become a maze, looping and recursive, impossible to navigate. They were trapped, and the fog only continued to thicken. On the 5th day, the people themselves started to change. Not dramatically at first, small things. A woman who had always been direct now spoke only in riddles. A man began walking on his hands for no reason he could explain. Children spoke in voices that didn't match their ages. The changes accelerated. By the 7th day, some villagers couldn't hold a consistent form. Their faces would shift subtly from moment to moment. Their heights would vary. Their mannerisms would transform mid-conversation. They were becoming like the fog itself, mutable, uncertain, neither one thing nor another. The mayor, a rational man named Henrik, tried to maintain order. He tried to convince people this was a natural phenomenon, perhaps a toxic gas from the seafloor or some bizarre weather anomaly. But deep down, he knew the truth. This was not natural. This was divine. On the 10th day, Tyr arrived. The god of justice walked through the fog as though it wasn't there. The mist parted before him and closed behind him, granting him a clear path. The villagers swarmed him immediately, begging for help, for an explanation, for salvation. Tyr listened to their stories. He examined the duplicates, the shifting faces, the recursive geography. His expression grew grave. He recognized the signature of this magic. Loki, the trickster god, the shapeshifter, the father of monsters and the god of chaos itself. But this was not one of Loki's pranks. This was not simple mischief or malice. This was something far worse. Tyr walked to the center of the village, to the old well that had served Havnibi for 300 years. He looked down into its dark, misty depths, and he understood. Loki was not causing this. Loki was trapped inside it. Tyr explained what he had discovered. 2 weeks ago, Loki had been traveling the coast in the form of a seabird, flying, shape-shifting, playing his usual games with reality. But something had gone horribly wrong. When shapeshifters change form, they must maintain a core sense of self, an anchor, the absolute knowledge of which shape is the real one, the original. Loki had been shifting so rapidly, so frequently, for so many centuries, that his anchor had begun to erode. And during that flight, while shifting from bird to mist to travel through a storm, he had lost it completely. He had forgotten which form was him. Was he the bird? The mist? Something else entirely? Unable to answer, unable to resolve back into a single form, Loki had fragmented. His consciousness had shattered, scattered across the fog itself. Every single droplet of moisture now contained a piece of the trickster god. Every wisp of mist held a fragment of his mind. And the fog, driven by Loki's confused divinity, was desperately trying to understand what it was. It was copying the villagers, trying their forms on like clothes. It created duplicates to explore the concept of identity. It shifted and changed, because that was what Loki did, but without purpose, without control. The trickster god had become the trick itself, lost inside his own nature, and he was dragging Havnibi down with him. The villagers demanded Tyr do something. He was a god. Surely he could dispel the fog, restore Loki, and save them. But Tyr shook his head. He had no power over shapeshifting. That was Loki's domain, and Loki's alone. Only the trickster could restore himself. But Loki couldn't restore himself, because he no longer knew which self to restore to. It was an impossible paradox, unless Tyr looked at the villagers, at their copied, shifting, uncertain forms. There might be a way, but it was incredibly dangerous, and it required a sacrifice. Someone would need to enter the fog completely, to let it consume them, to let Loki's fragmented consciousness experience them fully, and then, from inside that experience, remind Loki who he was, show him his true shape by reflecting it back to him. But whoever did this would become part of the fog. They would lose their own identity in the process, absorbed into Loki's confused consciousness forever. A permanent sacrifice. One life to save 300. The villagers looked at each other, a silent terror passing between them. No one volunteered. Then Henrik, the mayor, stepped forward. He was 68, he said. He had lived a full life. He had children and grandchildren who could leave Havnibi if he freed them. He would do it. Tyr tried to dissuade him, explaining exactly what it would mean. The loss of self. The dissolution into something other. An existence as a single thought inside a god's fractured mind. Henrik understood. And still, he agreed. His only request was that Tyr ensure his family made it out safely once the fog lifted. The god of justice gave his word. Henrik walked into the densest part of the fog. Within seconds, he began to change. His edges blurred. His form became uncertain. Copies of him appeared, each one slightly different. Young Henrik, middle-aged Henrik. Henrik as he might have been. Henrik as he feared he was. The fog swirled around him, through him, into him, and Henrik spoke. Not with his voice alone, but with every voice. The voice of the village, the voice of humanity, the voice of all those who maintain a single, consistent self through all of life's changes. He spoke to Loki, reminded him of who he had been, son of Laufey, blood brother of Odin, father of Fenrir, Jarmungandr, and Hel, the scarred one, the bound one, the one who had been chained beneath the earth with serpent venom dripping on his face until Ragnark, the one whose wife Seijen had held a bowl above him to catch the poison for centuries. The one who had a story, a history, a shape that was his own. Trickster, shapeshifter, chaos bringer, but singular, unique, himself. Henrik poured everything he was into that reminder. His memories of maintaining his identity through aging, through loss, through change. The core self that persisted even as the body and mind transformed. The fog began to pulse, to contract, to coalesce. The villagers watched for hours as the fog slowly drew inward, toward the center of the village, toward Henrik, who stood motionless, no longer quite human, becoming something else entirely. The duplicates vanished one by one. The looping landscape straightened. And finally, as the sun set on the 10th day, the fog condensed into a single point, into a figure. Loki, the trickster god, stood in the village square, fully formed, fully himself. Red hair, sharp features, and eyes that held far too much knowledge and too much pain. He looked exhausted, haunted, like someone who had been lost for years rather than days. Tyr approached him and asked if he knew who he was. Loki nodded slowly. Yes, he knew. Henrik's sacrifice had given him back his anchor, his center, his self. But the cost was evident. Where Henrik had stood, there was nothing. The mayor had been completely absorbed. His consciousness now existed as a permanent part of Loki's mind, a human perspective embedded in a god's awareness. Henrik was gone, but also eternal. Loki looked at the villagers, at the people who had suffered because of his loss of control. He could not undo what had happened, but he could offer them a gift, compensation, a way to balance the scales. He walked to each person in Havnibi and touched their forehead, and he gave them a piece of his nature. Not the ability to physically shapeshift, that would be too dangerous for mortals, but the ability to change themselves in smaller ways, to adjust their appearance slightly through will alone, to age more slowly, to heal minor wounds, to adapt. A tiny fraction of the trickster's power, carefully controlled and safely contained. It would pass to their children and become part of Havenby's bloodline forever. A reminder and an apology. Before he left, Loki asked Tyr how long he had been lost, how many days had passed. 10 days, Tyr answered. Only 10. Loki's expression was hollow. For him, fragmented across the fog, it had been centuries, millennia, an eternity of confused existence, unable to coalesce, unable to end. Only Henrik's sacrifice had freed him. The trickster god looked at the empty space where the mayor had stood, and for perhaps the first time in his existence, Loki wept. Not tears of mischief or manipulation, but genuine grief for the man who had saved him, for the identity he had nearly lost forever. Tyr placed a hand on Loki's shoulder, and for a moment, the god of justice and the god of chaos understood each other perfectly. Havnibi recovered slowly. The villagers adjusted to their new gifts, learning to use them carefully, subtly. They erected a monument in the village square, a stone carved with Henrik's name and a simple inscription. He knew who he was. The fog never returned to Havnibi. Loki ensured that. And sometimes, when the weather turned gray and misty, the villagers would hear a voice in the wind. Henrik's voice, still present, still himself, living on as a thought inside a god's mind. The sacrifice had been complete, but not cruel, and Loki, for all his trickery, honored that presence. He listened to it. He let it guide him. The shapeshifter had learned something from the man who never changed. Identity is not about form. It is about continuity. It's about knowing who you are, even when everything else transforms. And sometimes, the greatest trick is simply remaining yourself. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more dark stories from the edge of myth and reality. And comment below where in the world you are listening from tonight.